Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today we're talking about the Church of Jesus Christ Restored out of Ontario, Canada. And this church was actually a very dangerous, very predatory cult. A lot of the names of the victims and family members of the victims have not been released to the public, so that's why there won't be a lot of specific names mentioned in this video. Before we get into the case, let's go ahead and briefly talk about today's sponsor. This video is sponsored by Wild Grain. Wild Grain is the first ever bake from frozen subscription box offering pastries, sourdough breads, and hand-cut pastas shipped directly to your door. I love that I get to support small bakeries from all across the country and that my freezer is always stocked with delicious wild grain goods. And you get to build your own subscription box as well, so you can make sure that your monthly deliveries are full of all of your favorite things. In this month's box, I received croissants, lemon ginger biscuits, giant chocolate chip cookies, slow fermented ciabatta sandwich buns, rigatoni, churned French butter, and of course, Wild Grain's signature sourdough. Wild Grain is known for their sourdough bread. This is hands down my favorite bread. This sourdough is made using a slow fermentation process that's easier on your belly, and it's also richer in nutrients and antioxidants, and it can even help to lower blood sugar spikes. And the lemon ginger biscuits are so good. They go perfectly with like a hot cup of coffee or tea. Another thing that I love about Wild Grain is how they offer seasonal items such as the lemon ginger biscuits. They're like the perfect little summertime treat. And I have talked about these pumpkin cinnamon biscuits multiple times, but they were so good. I got them in last fall's box, and I really hope that they bring these back this year. You guys already know how much I love Wild Grain. They made it so much easier for my family to have high quality, delicious baked goods ready and on the table quickly, because every item bakes in 25 minutes or less. That's straight out of the freezer, no thawing required, no waiting for bread to rise. It's literally take it out of the freezer, pop it into the oven, and in 25 minutes or less, we have fresh, delicious baked goods. And it's no surprise to me that Wild Grain has been voted the #1 subscription service for 2 years in a row. They also help to fight hunger by donating 2 meals for every order they receive to the Greater Boston Food Bank and other organizations, and it's nice to know that my purchase will help to benefit those in need. And if you want to check out Wild Grain for yourself, be sure to click on my link in the description box and use my code SUMMER to get $30 off your first box, plus you'll get free croissants for life. A big thank you to Wild Grain for sponsoring this video, and now let's get into the case. Carol Dennis was born on December 18th, 1952 in Englehart, Ontario. She had one brother, and I couldn't find the names of any of her family members, but we will be talking about her mom and dad quite a bit, so we're going to call her mom Mary and her dad Tony, just so I'm not constantly saying Carol's mom and Carol's dad repeatedly throughout this video. Now, when Carol was an infant, she got very, very sick, like so sick that the doctors did not think she was going to make it. Polio was causing a widespread panic during the early 50s, and cases were popping up all over the place. So in the beginning, they thought that that's probably what it was. But after some testing, it was determined that Carol actually had bacterial meningitis. Bacterial meningitis is a very serious infection that causes the protective membrane that surrounds the spine and brain to become very inflamed. And back in the 1950s, the chances of survival were not very good. Close to half of the children that contracted bacterial meningitis did not survive. And Carol fell into a coma for 3 days as her little body tried to fight off the infection, and her family had to mentally prepare themselves that Carol was probably not going to come out of this alive. But Carol was a fighter, and after being unconscious for 3 days, she woke up and she went on to make a full recovery. And then not long after Carol recovered, the family decided to move to a different city. They moved 400 miles south to a city called Owen Sound, Ontario. Now, Carol's father worked various jobs throughout his life. He was a taxi driver, a bus driver, he was a lineman at one point, but eventually he got a job working as a custodian for one of the local schools. The family didn't have much money. Carol's father often had to work 2 jobs just to keep the family going, and her mother also worked. She worked at a grocery store, and she was also the primary caregiver to the 2 children, which unfortunately was not a good thing. As far as I could tell from the research, Mary was never officially diagnosed with a specific mental illness, but based on what we know about her, I think it's safe to say that there was some issue going on. Mary has been described as extremely manipulative and emotionally abusive. Mary was just one of those people who you had to tiptoe around. Anything was likely to set her off. Her moods would swing from one extreme to the next, and Carol seemed to find herself on the receiving end of her mother's bad moods a lot. Mary was very manipulative and controlling of Carol. There were times when Mary would tuck Carol into bed at night, and she would tell Carol that she better pray for her because she, Mary, might not be alive by morning. Mary was telling Carol that she might decide to take her own life while Carol was asleep. And so there were nights when Carol would be terrified that she would wake up and her mother would be dead. She would literally cry herself to sleep because she was so worried that her mom would not be there by morning. So things at home are not the greatest. Mary's mental health is not good, and to top it off, she started drinking as a way to cope with whatever she was dealing with. And people outside of the immediate family started to take notice of this, and they started to see these concerning behaviors from Mary as well. And in an attempt to help the situation, one day Mary's mother showed up at their house and she handed Mary a copy of the Book of Mormon. She thought that religion, more specifically the Mormon religion, might bring Mary some peace. And Mary immediately threw herself into the Book of Mormon. She's reading and rereading the Book of Mormon, and soon she started applying the stuff that she was reading to her everyday outlook on life. She did stop drinking, which was definitely a good thing for her. Alcohol was not helping her mental state, but that was really the only good thing that came out of this newfound love for Mormonism, because Mary turned into a religious fanatic, and this is when life in the Dennis household took a very bizarre turn. Now, the family had been religious before this point. I'm not sure what denomination, if any, they identified as, but they weren't Mormon. They prayed, they attended church and stuff. Religion was part of their family, but once this shift to LDS happened, Mary started to live and breathe Mormonism. Everything was about this religion, and this was a massive change in their household. You know, the children were now being restricted in ways that they hadn't been before, and Mary just overall became more controlling and more strict. If Mary's extended family members were ever over for a visit, she would force Carol to sit in a chair, and she would have to stay there in that chair all alone and not move. She wasn't allowed to go out and play with her cousins or anything. She just had to sit. Mary became more controlling of how her kids dressed, who they talked to, and she was now teaching her children an entirely new religious doctrine. And so Carol didn't really take to this change right away. Mary was becoming so incredibly fanatical, and Carol could sense that there was this weird shift in her mother, and it kind of freaked her out. And so Carol would push back a little, she would question certain teachings. Carol didn't just immediately fall in line, and this is when things really started to get bad for her. Mary became convinced that Carol was possessed by demons, and she would tell people that Carol was more vulnerable to demons because of her near-death experience back when she was an infant and she had contracted bacterial meningitis. Mary thought that this infection had caused Carol to have mental problems, which made her more susceptible to a demonic possession. And Mary would say this so often that over time, Carol started to question if this might actually be true. And this is when the exorcism started. Carol would wake up to her mother on top of her, violently shaking her by the shoulders, chanting prayer in order to get the supposed demons out of her daughter. She would also have ministers come into their home and perform what can only be described as an exorcism. Carol would be told to lie down, the minister would repeatedly chant a prayer over her, and Mary would jump on top of Carol and start violently shaking her. And when all of that didn't work, Mary started forcing Carol to take prescription drugs in order to keep her calm and subdued. She was essentially a zombie on this medication, but Mary was going to do whatever it took to have complete control over Carol's mind. And where was Tony in all of this? Well, he was mostly detached from what was happening in the house. Like I mentioned earlier, he worked a lot, multiple jobs, and so he didn't see the full picture. He didn't know everything that Mary was doing while he was gone. He also wasn't nearly as involved in the LDS stuff. He went along with some of it for Mary's sake, but he was never super into Mormonism like she was. So Carol didn't really have anyone advocating for her. And life would just continue like this for the next several years. And then by the time Carol was 16, Mary had fully convinced her that something truly was wrong with her mentally. Mary started taking Carol to doctors, claiming that something was wrong with her daughter's brain. And she even managed to convince the doctors that this was true. Carol was subjected to tons of medical testing, and some of the testing took a serious physical toll on her. One of the tests was called pneumoencephalography, and it involves draining the cerebrospinal fluid from the brain, and then air would be injected into the space between the brain itself and the membrane. And then an x-ray would be taken of the head, and that air would outline the brain and allow for better imaging. However, this was a very painful, very risky procedure. In fact, several people died due to complications from this procedure. They don't even practice this procedure anymore. Thankfully, Carol did not die, but she did have severe side effects from the testing. She had extremely painful headaches and excessive vomiting for weeks. Carol was put through this absolute hell, all for the doctors to find literally nothing wrong with her. Her brain was completely normal. Mary then decided that Carol should be committed to a psychiatric hospital. She would was in the hospital for 6 weeks, but Carol has said that those 6 weeks actually brought her more peace than she had had in years. For once, she was out from under her mother's watchful eye. She wasn't having to walk on eggshells. She didn't have to endure the weird exorcisms and the constant ridicule and manipulation. She could finally just be alone at peace. But sadly, this was just the calm before the storm, because Carol's life was about to take an even more horrific turn. So Carol gets out of the hospital and she tries to put her life back together, but she's finding it a little bit difficult. She was back in her mother's clutches. She was once again under her control, and she had missed so much school at this point that she just decided not to go back. She just felt like she was too far behind. But ever since she was a little girl, she had dreams of becoming a nurse, and she wasn't ready to fully let go of those dreams. And so she started volunteering as a candy striper at a hospital. She also landed a position at a nursing home, and Carol really enjoyed this line of work. She was a very nurturing person. She naturally liked taking care of people, so this line of work was perfect for her. And for once, she was starting to feel like things were looking up, like she might actually have a future. And she also had dreams of meeting a guy and falling in love, getting married, starting a family. But all of these dreams were snatched away from her in the worst way imaginable. The Mormon church that Carol and her family had been attending for the last several years was starting to make some changes that some of the more traditional Mormons weren't really happy about. They were evolving in a way that rubbed the more conservative members of the church the wrong way. And so in the early 70s, several members of the church left and they started forming their own little breakaway groups. And one of those groups became known as the Church of Jesus Christ Restored. And now we have to introduce the first disgusting predator in this story, a man named Stan King. Stan King was in his early 40s. He was married to a woman named Erna, and they had 3 sons named Judson, Joe, and Fred. Stan and his family had been members of Carol's church, and they were one of the many traditional families that had left. Now, Stan had spoken at the old church on multiple occasions, and everyone thought that he was a really great, powerful speaker. He had been well known and well liked by all the other congregants. And so when Stan announced to the group that God had told him that he was to be the prophet of their new church, no one really questioned it because Stan seemed like an obvious choice. Most of you are probably aware of this, but Mormons believe in prophets. These people are thought to have a direct connection to God. They receive revelations from God. There's only one prophet at a time. The current one is this guy, Russell Nelson, and Stan King was now selected to be the prophet of his breakaway group. And this group was going back to the basics, back to the fundamentals of Joseph Smith's teachings, which of course meant polygamy was back. But not for everyone in the group. Part of the perks of Stan's new position as prophet was that he and only he got to have multiple wives. And as you probably already guessed, Mary was a part of this mass exodus because she considered herself a traditionalist. She joined Stan King's newly formed group, the Church of Jesus Christ Restored, and Mary became one of Stan's closest confidants within the group. She became part of his inner circle. So Stan started to stop by Mary's house for visits pretty often, and this is when he started taking a particular interest in Carol, who is still a teenager by this point. Stan's like 43 or so. He's more than twice Carol's age, and the 3 kids that he shared with his actual wife, Erna, were around the same age as Carol. She had actually been in the same youth group with a couple of his sons. They had been friends, and now their dad is hitting on her. The whole thing just creeped her out. And then one day, Mary sat Carol down and told her something that would completely change the course of Carol's life. She said, "The prophet has chosen you to be one of his church wives, and you are going to give birth to his special sons." Mary looked at this as a great honor, but Carol was super grossed out by it, and she was not on board whatsoever. But Mary said those famous words that we've heard so many times in these cult cases. She told Carol that this was her calling. It was God's will. God wanted her to do this, and she should feel honored. However, Carol still was not having it. She told her mother that she did not want to marry Stan King. But did Mary take Carol's opinion into consideration? Of course she didn't. Instead of telling Stan King, "I'm sorry, but my teenage daughter doesn't want to marry you," she instead resorted to her old trick of heavily medicating Carol. This medication, which I don't know what this medication was, there's nothing about it in the research, it just says medication, but whatever it was, it made Carol so much easier to control because she was once again walking around in this foggy mental state. So one day Stan told Mary to bring Carol over to his house, which was a secluded farmhouse near Sauble Beach in Ontario. And this visit was just weird. Stan was obviously showing sexual interest in Carol, and he was doing this right in front of Mary. It was extremely awkward. And Carol actually got physically ill during this visit because she was so disturbed by the thought of this man even thinking of her sexually. So that visit did not go as planned. But then Stan requested another meeting with Carol. This time they met up at another church member's house, and it was just Carol and Stan. Mary wasn't there, no one else was there. But this had actually been a trick. No one told Carol that she was going to be there alone with Stan. And so Stan goes and sits on the couch and he turns on the TV and he tells Carol to come sit next to him, which she very reluctantly did. And before she knew it, he was making his move. He was groping her, he was trying to kiss her. Carol immediately jumped up and she begged to go home. This teenager obviously doesn't want a 40-something-year-old married man to touch her in this way, but he just keeps pushing and getting her into these really vulnerable scenarios. It's just all very disturbing. And now Stan was starting to get a little annoyed. You know, he was the prophet after all, and this dumb girl should feel proud that the prophet would want her to be one of his wives. So a few days later, Mary goes to Carol and she's like, hey, that church member wants to have a talk with you. This was the same lady whose house Stan had assaulted Carol in a few days earlier. So Mary and Carol arrive at this house, and as soon as this lady opens the door, she pulls Carol inside and she just starts yelling at her about like, how dare she reject the prophet's advances? She should feel so grateful. And then she proceeds to beat the hell out of Carol right in front of Mary. And do you think that Mary tried to interfere and stop the beating? Of course not. She sat there and watched it happen. And that day it was decided that Carol would go live with another member of the church so they could teach her the proper way to behave as one of the prophet's chosen wives. For an entire month, Carol was forced to live with basically complete strangers and learn how to obey her future husband, how to serve him and put him above everything else. Once she was done with that training, Stan forced Carol to quit her job at the nursing home, and she was forced to go live at his farmhouse with him and his other wives and children. So at this point, he was legally married to Erna, that was his one and only legal wife, and their 3 kids, Judson, Joe, and Fred. Then he had 3 more church wives and their kids, and now Carol was living there with all of them with the intention of making her his 4th church wife. Carol knew that she wouldn't officially become a church wife until she and Stan consummated the marriage. Those were the rules. And so she did everything in her power to stall for as long as possible. She would try to stay busy all day with chores on the farm. She would go to bed as early as possible so she could be asleep before he could try anything sexual. But Stan started to catch on to what she was doing, and eventually he forced her to sleep in his bed. But Carol would basically just be at the very edge of her side of the bed, you know, just facing the opposite direction, making it blatantly obvious that she did not want him to touch her. And then Stan started inviting some of the other wives to come into the room and have sex with him, literally while Carol was right next to them in the bed. I think that he thought this would entice Carol to join in, but that was not the case. She would just turn her back to them and try to pretend like it wasn't happening. After weeks of managing to escape the inevitable, Stan finally demanded that Carol have sex with him. He knew she wanted nothing to do with him, and he still forced this terrified girl to have sex with him. And once Stan had assaulted Carol, she officially became a church wife. And this would be the beginning of a nearly 40-year sentence of servitude, religious manipulation, and abuse in every sense of the word. Stan took 4 more church wives after Carol, and these girls were so incredibly young. One girl was 14 years old, and another girl was only 10 years old. Stan King, the prophet of the Church of Jesus Christ Restored, was a vile child predator. And just to add an extra layer of horror to this story, some of the wives were actually mother-daughter duos. For example, remember the lady who beat Carol for rejecting Stan? Well, she was actually one of Stan's wives, and the 10-year-old was her own daughter. This woman allowed her child to be sexually assaulted repeatedly by Stan King. And the mothers of the girls that he took as his church wives would also be called in to just have sex with him. They weren't considered his church wives. They just got the great honor and privilege of pleasing the prophet. Stan would always be demanding sex from the girls, and he would force them all to take part in his fantasies. He would force them to have group sex sessions with him. And remember, some of these church wives are little children. They were essentially sex slaves and domestic slaves because they would also have tons of chores to do around the farm every single day. The women would be forced to cook mass massive meals for all of the families living on the farm. They had no free will. They had to ask permission from the prophet to do anything outside of the cult. Carol, at this point, was still being given strong prescription medication to keep her calm through all of this torture that she was going through. But like I said, the medication started to cause memory loss. And there was one occasion where Carol accidentally over-medicated herself because she forgot that she had already taken her medications that day. She ended up losing consciousness and she had to be rushed to the hospital for treatment. So, life in this cult goes on like this for a while. Carol is completely controlled by the cult and her husband, the prophet. She's being forced to sleep with him all the time. She's having to take part in these like basically orgies, and she's living in a fog, partly because of the medication, but also because she's so incredibly unhappy. And then about 5 years into her time in the cult, Carol's grandmother passed away, and she had to ask Stan's permission to attend the funeral. Remember, they weren't allowed to do anything outside of the cult without the prophet's permission. And he did grant her permission. What a great guy. Now, Carol hadn't seen much of either of her parents leading up to this funeral. Tony didn't really want anything to do with Stan King, which eventually drove a wedge between he and Mary. And because Tony had never fully committed to the cult, had never fully committed to Mormonism in general, Stan did not want him anywhere near Carol because he was worried that she would be easily influenced by her father. And so Stan would always intercept Tony's phone calls. He would not allow Tony to visit. No matter how hard Tony had tried to reconnect with his daughter, he was never successful, and he had not seen her in years until that day at the funeral. Carol did finally get to see her dad that day, but he was so extremely distraught over losing his mother, they didn't really get a chance to discuss what was happening in Carol's life. And what had Mary been up to? Well, she had moved to the United States at Stan's request. She moved to the state of Missouri on what I'm assuming was like a missionary situation, trying to gain new members, you know? So she and Tony were not even living together at this point. I'm not sure if they were divorced or just separated, but they were living totally separate lives at the very least. But the kicker was that Mary was not even a member of the cult anymore. She had decided to leave the cult just a few years after literally delivering her young, terrified teenage daughter to Stan King on a silver platter, only then to walk away from that cult and leave her there. Maybe if Mary had come to some realization that Stan King was a false prophet and she had tried to help Carol escape, then maybe Mary could have redeemed herself just a little bit. But no, she never tried to help Carol escape. She never reached out to her. She never apologized to her for anything that she had put her through. She just left her daughter there to live out the rest of her days with a sexual predator. And Carol was so deep by this point, she was so brainwashed that she didn't take her mother's leaving the church as a sign that maybe she should leave as well. And then something happened that would make it even harder for Carol to leave the cult, because she found out that she was pregnant with her first child. Now, Stan was only interested in having sons. At this point, he had like 6 or 7 wives, and they're having all of these babies, but the only babies that Stan was ever interested in were the boy babies. The girls were of no interest to him whatsoever. He couldn't care less about the girls. He wanted to make as many heirs as humanly possible, and girls in the cult had zero value to him. One of the wives, who was only 15 at the time, by the way, gave birth to a baby girl, and Stan got angry with her as if she had done something wrong. Now, after seeing Carol at the funeral, her dad decided that enough was enough. You know, he hadn't had any luck with phone calls or visits to the farm, and he really wanted to make sure that his daughter was okay. And so he finally decided to get the police involved, and he requested a welfare check. Sadly, nothing came of this welfare check, though. Stan had Carol and some of the other wives hide inside the house, and he went out and used his charm to convince the officers that Carol was totally fine and her father was just crazy. The officers totally bought it, and they left, and they didn't think twice about it. But this visit did worry Stan because he thought that Carol's father might insist on more visits in the future. He was worried that police might find out that he was the leader of a weird Mormon breakaway cult and he was practicing polygamy, which was illegal. And because of this, it was decided that Carol would legally marry Joe King, Stan's son with Erna, his legal wife. This would get the heat off of Stan if Carol's dad ever questioned the paternity of the baby. They could just say that it was Joe's baby. And in 1977, Carol gave birth to her first son, James, and just 18 months later, she welcomed her second son, who she named Marcus. And these two boys gave Carol a reason to live. They made her so incredibly happy, and she just tried to focus on being the best mother she possibly could be. But the birth of James and Marcus caused some issues within the group. Because Carol had given Stan two sons, he started to show favoritism towards her and James and Marcus, and this made the other wives extremely jealous. And it wasn't just the wives that were jealous. Stan's three older sons, with Erna, Judson, Joe, and Fred, they did not like all of this attention that Carol and her kids were now getting. In fact, Fred had had trouble accepting the church wives from the very beginning. He just didn't like the situation. And now that Carol and her kids were getting special treatment, he started to become hostile. He would be super mean to James and Marcus for no reason. He would tease them, and he would deliberately do weird things to make them cry. He's only 7 years younger than Carol, and so he's in his early 20s acting like this, bullying little children. But this was just foreshadowing. This was a sign of things to come, because Fred was actually a very evil person, which we will get into very soon. So by the early 80s, Stan King had 7 wives and 10 children and a devoted and growing congregation. The group had amassed about 80 members, and they had outgrown the farm as their headquarters. And so in 1982, Stan bought an old abandoned ski lodge, and this would become the new church headquarters. And the cult simply called it the Property. And the Property would soon become a house of horrors for the members of the cult. In 1986, Stan King suffered a stroke and died. But the nightmare was far from over, because like I said, Stan was not the only evil person in this story. Before he died, Stan had named an heir to take his place as prophet of the Church of Jesus Christ Restored. His son Fred was chosen as the new leader. Fred was just plain sadistic, and his reign of terror began the moment that Stan King took his last breath. The day that Stan died, Fred was furious. He blamed the church wives for his father's death. Now, Carol happened to be in the room the moment that Stan passed away, and so Fred comes into the room and he orders Carol to start performing CPR because he was convinced that he could bring his father back to life. He did the chest compressions, and he ordered Carol to give Stan's dead body mouth to mouth. And the entire time that this is happening, Fred is screaming at Carol to try harder. He's calling her all kind of terrible things. This went on for a very long time until Fred had to accept the fact that CPR was not going to work. But he was still convinced that his father wasn't truly gone, and he thought that he could raise him from the dead. So he ordered Carol to start washing Stan's body in order to bring him back to life. So for an entire week, Carol had to repeatedly wash Stan's dead body and watch for any signs of life. Now, Carol knew that Stan was not going to come back, but she had to play along because Fred was now the new leader of this cult, and he was not ready to call it quits. By the end of that week, Stan's body was not only starting to swell and bloat and look distorted, but as you can imagine, the stench was absolutely unbearably horrific. Carol had to wrap a scarf around her nose and mouth to keep from vomiting. And at the end of that week, finally, one of the higher up members of the church convinced Fred that Stan was not coming back. So they call an ambulance to report the death, and when the medics arrive, they can tell that this person had been dead for days. Their excuse for the delayed reporting was that Erna, Stan's legal wife, had been so distraught about his death that she had held on to the body for a week. They bought the story, and no one really asked any questions. And now Fred is officially the new prophet of the church and the leader of the cult, and this is when things take an even more disturbing turn, because Fred wasn't just a sexual predator, he was extremely violent. So first of all, as soon as Fred proclaimed himself the new prophet, he kicked out a few of the church wives and their children. Carol and her sons were among those who were kicked off the farm, and they were forced to move to a little apartment in the city of Guelph, which was a couple hours drive away. Carol and another church wife were assigned to live together. This woman's name was Angie, and she didn't like Carol. I'm not really sure why. Probably over jealousy over Stan's favoritism towards Carol. I don't really know. But this living situation was not the best. But Carol was just happy to not be a church wife anymore. You know, she was still attending church services just like she always did. She was still obeying the prophet, but she would no longer be trapped in a polygamous relationship and be forced to be a sex slave, basically, and that alone gave her a little hope for her future. Fred ordered Carol to get a job cleaning houses, and she was forced to hand over her entire paycheck to Fred. She and Angie and their children lived in a cramped little apartment, and they were given very little money to live on by the church. So they were living their lives in Guelph during the week, and then every weekend they would make the 2-hour journey to the property for church services. And with Fred now at the helm, the church services became became very dark and extremely violent. Fred's sermons were all about how evil and sinful all of the followers were. He would spend hours chastising them and yelling and screaming at them about how horrible they were. And these services would go on for hours and hours late into the night. Fred would just be berating everyone. And eventually, Fred started to also assault his followers in the middle of church services. He would beat them right there in front of everyone. And age was not a factor for Fred. He would beat children, he would beat their parents, he would beat their grandparents. He did not care. There was a member who was a little 80-year-old lady that everyone called Nana. Everyone loved this lady. And one night, Fred had kept everyone there at the ski lodge super late. And Nana accidentally dozed off in the middle of one of Fred's sermons. And he became completely enraged. He forced this 80-year-old woman to stand up for the rest of the church service with her pants pulled down to her ankles. There was another time when a little boy who was about 12 years old was being yelled at by Fred during a service. Fred was screaming at him, calling him lazy and ungrateful, and then Fred started assaulting this child. He was hitting him over the head repeatedly, and his parents were sitting right there watching this all go down. And the mother of that particular child was also often a target for Fred. He would force this woman to get down on her hands and knees, and then he would proceed to punch and kick her in front of everyone. There was another time when the young boys in the cult were being forced to do gardening chores at the property, and Fred would walk around and patrol to make sure that the kids were working up to his standards. Well, one boy apparently wasn't working hard enough for Fred, so as punishment, he beat this child with the handle of a shovel so hard that the handle broke in two. And because Fred had always been jealous of Carol and her sons, they also became targets. Fred was way more strict on Carol's kids than he was on the other kids in the cult. They had extra rules put on them. And one of those rules was that James and Marcus were not allowed to have access to a computer. And this didn't just pertain to the church computer. They weren't allowed to touch any computer ever at all. But one day Marcus was trying to finish up a school project, and this project required him to use a computer. Now Marcus was terrified because he knew what would happen to him if he got caught, but he also didn't want to fail this assignment. And so he secretly went down to the library one day and he got on the computer. He quickly got whatever he needed, and then he finished up his assignment. Well, the next weekend, as Carol and the boys were pulling up to the property for church services, they see Fred standing outside holding a cane, and he's just waiting for them to pull up. And as soon as they parked, he ordered all three of them to get out of the car, and he proceeded to brutally beat Marcus with the cane. Someone had found out that Marcus used the computer at the library, and they went and told Fred. After he got done beating Marcus, he beat James and Carol as well, just for good measure. This type of abuse became the norm for Carol and her children and many of the others in the cult. And Fred would warn the members that if they ever tried to leave, he would, quote, hunt you down and kill you. When 9/11 happened and the two towers fell, Fred blamed it on his followers. He told them that the towers had fallen and thousands of lives had been lost because they had a filthy spiritual condition. And in church one day, he called out Carol specifically and blamed her for the deaths of all the children. And I think that he did that to Carol because he knew how much she loved kids, and he knew that this would hurt her the most. And I haven't mentioned this yet, but the King family owned a printing business. That's how the cult made most of its money. And some of the kids in the cult would be withdrawn from school at the age of 14 or 15, and they would be forced to start working at the printing business. And as a reward for their hard work, they would receive $10 a week. And as they got older, they would get a raise of $20 per week. And by older, I mean into adulthood. Grown men and women were earning $20 per week to work this full-time job. And things just continued to get worse because about a year after Fred had taken over the cult, he announced that he would be marrying all of his father's church wives. And when I read this at first, I was kind of confused because he had always hated the church wives starting from when he was really young, so why would he want to take them for himself? But then once you realize what a sadistic monster Fred was, it makes more sense. I think that he wanted to take the women over so that he could make their lives even worse. And one day, Fred showed up at Carol's apartment and he told her to take off her pants and get on the bed so they could consummate their marriage. Carol was completely revolted by Fred. First of all, he had been her stepson for the last several years. He was also the half-brother to her sons. So the idea of having sex with Fred disturbed her on multiple levels. But Carol felt like she had no choice, and so she did what she was told. And she was devastated because as bad as things were under Fred's rule, Carol thought at the very least she would no longer be forced to have sex against her will. She thought that her days as a sex slave to the prophet were over, but now here she was again being assaulted on a regular basis. Fred had his legal wife, whose name was Linda, and now he had taken over all of his father's church wives, and he treated them horribly. He didn't even view the women in the cult as people. He would compare them to cattle. He would say, the wives are like cattle, just breed them at the right time and they'll drop another calf. And unfortunately, Fred had his father's same disgusting attraction to little girls because he also married, assaulted a 10-year-old child. Fred had multiple children over the years with his wives, but Carol never got pregnant by him. Thankfully, she had had a hysterectomy years earlier due to some ongoing medical issues, and Carol could not stay on Fred's good side because her roommate Angie would constantly run and tell on her to Fred for literally anything. There was one time when Carol wanted to buy some books for Fred's kids for their birthday as a gift, just trying to do something nice for his children. But Carol didn't have enough money for the books. Remember, she had to hand over her paychecks to the church and she was given very little money to live on. So to earn a little bit of extra money for the books, she and her sons got a side job picking raspberries. Well, Angie found out about it and she ran and told Fred. So the next Sunday at church, Fred called Carol outside and he confronted her about getting a job without his permission. Carol tried to explain why she got the job. She told him that she only did that so that she could buy his children a birthday present, but he didn't care. He was screaming at her, he was yelling at her, calling her all kind of terrible things, and then he grabbed her and started repeatedly slamming her body against a pillar until she eventually lost consciousness. When she finally came to, she was bloody, her clothes were all ripped up, and Fred had just left her lying there on the ground. Carol has said that to this day, she still has pain from that particular beating. After that, Carol was essentially put under house arrest because Fred was pushing this narrative that she couldn't be trusted. She was no longer allowed to go anywhere unless she was being supervised at all times. And even under supervision, she was only allowed to go a few approved places. And of course, she could go to church. That was pretty much all she could do. She wasn't allowed to read unless it was something approved by Fred, mostly just religious stuff. She could sometimes watch TV, but it was extremely limited and the shows had to be approved. So she would pass the time by pacing. She would just pace all around the apartment. This went on for 7.5 years. She was trapped in that apartment for 7.5 years. And this took a major toll on her mentally and physically as well. The lack of adequate movement started to take a toll on her muscles, and she started getting swelling in her legs. She had chronic pain from the beatings that she had endured. It was just a miserable existence. And at this point, she saw no way out. I personally think that Fred didn't even care about the church from a religious standpoint. I think that he was actually just a sadist who hated all of the members. And so he took over so that he would have a group of people to constantly torment. As Fred became more and more unhinged and violent, some of the members did start to leave. The cult numbers dwindled down over the years from 80 to about 30. And in 1996, one of the men in the cult managed to escape, and he immediately went and reported the abuse to the police. He told them about the beatings. He told them about being forced to hand over all of his money. Apparently, this particular member had been a regular target for Fred, and he was beaten so often and so brutally that the other members were worried that Fred might accidentally kill him one day. So this guy goes and reports all of this to the police, and maybe because the story sounded so far-fetched, the police didn't seem to really believe him, and they asked him to give them the name of someone who could back up these claims before they were willing to investigate. Well, he did know of a woman that had recently escaped, and so he gave her information to the police, but when they went and asked her about these claims, she denied everything, probably out of fear. And so the police did not look any further into it, which is absolutely negligence on the part of the police. That was back in 1996. So much abuse could have been prevented if the police would have properly investigated the church. But unfortunately, it would be years before Fred King would finally be caught. And his downfall started in 2007 when Carol's oldest son, James, who was now in his 30s, decided to leave the cult. At this point, James was still being beaten on a regular basis. He was still being berated. His money was being taken, was starting to wake up and realize that everything that Fred said was bullshit. Like, his mind was finally finally clear, and he couldn't take it anymore, and he just knew he had to get out. Fred had drilled it into his followers' heads that if they left, they would be condemned to hell, they would never make it into heaven. But the situation had gotten so bad that James decided that he would just rather take his chances and risk going to hell than stay and literally live a nightmare every day of his life. James told Carol and Marcus about his plan to leave, and they were both actually on board at first. James had managed to find someone on the outside to help him escape, and in April of 2007, he was ready to go. At that point, Carol and Marcus were still too scared to make that leap. And so James said, look, I know you're not ready to go right now, but when you are ready, just let me know and I will help you to escape. And he gave them a phone number where he could be reached, and then he left. And once James left, Carol became even more depressed. And she was also being targeted even more by Fred because he blamed her for James leaving. And then in March of 2008, Carol finally got the push that she needed to leave. During a church service, Fred attacked Carol. He started assaulting her in front of everyone. He was slapping her, he was violently shaking her, he was pulling her hair, and then he spat in her face. In that moment, Carol decided that she had to leave, and she managed to sneak away to a payphone, and she called that number that James had given her, and she said, I'm ready. And a few days later, she was gone. But unfortunately, she left alone because Marcus at the last minute decided that he wasn't going to leave. Carol had begged Marcus to come with her, but he was still so terrified that he would go to hell if he left, and so he decided to stay. She and James reunited, and they started on their journey to heal from the decades of abuse. Carol got a job cleaning office buildings, and that's when she met a man who would become her future husband, John Christie. John became Carol's rock. He was so supportive when she finally decided to tell him about her past. For the first time in her entire life, she was finally with someone that she truly loved. She was granted a divorce from Joe King. Remember, she was forced to marry him back in the 70s when she was pregnant with James. And then she and John got married in October of 2009, and they began their lives together. And once Carol finally started to heal and she really started to live her life, the realization hit her that she had been a prisoner for almost 40 years. She was forced into that cult back in the 70s, and it was now the early 2000s. She had lost so much of her life. So Carol decided that it was finally time to get some justice. In 2010, she decided to file a civil suit against the Church of Jesus Christ Restored and Fred specifically. The allegations consisted of physical, emotional, and sexual abuse. This meant hearings and talking to witnesses, hearing testimony from other former members in preparation for the trial. And it also meant depositions where Fred King had to sit through hours of very disturbing questions concerning the horrific things that he had done to Carol and the others. The lawyer who questioned Fred said that looking at his eyes was like looking at dead eyes, and he could tell that Fred did not like the fact that he, the all-powerful prophet, was being questioned. In the end, Fred King decided that it would be best for him to settle out of court for an undisclosed amount. He didn't want this information getting out to the public. Remember, the cult owned a very successful printing company, and he was probably worried the business would suffer if the public found out that it was being ran by a cult and that forced child labor was a common occurrence. But thankfully, everything was about to come to light, and the public would finally find out this secretive, abusive cult had been active in their community for years. The only stipulation for the settlement was that Carol was not allowed to disclose the amount that they had settled for. So this meant that as long as she did not disclose the dollar amount, she could say and do whatever she wanted to do. And what Carol wanted to do was to finally tell her story to the world. She started by doing an interview with a popular Canadian TV show called W5 with host Victor Malarick. Carol sat down with Victor and she told him her story, and she did not hold back. The episode aired in November of 2012, and it sent a shockwave through Ontario. People could not believe what they were hearing, that this level of abuse had gone unnoticed and unchecked for decades, and that the cult was still active.
A secretive sect, a dominating leader, young brides taken on faith.
10 was the youngest.
10?
He would scream, if you leave this church, I will hunt you down and kill you.
And the interview ended up catching the attention of detectives with the Ontario Provincial Police, and they immediately started an investigation into the cult. They started by interviewing Fred's current church wives, and detectives found it strange because they interviewed them separately, but they would answer the exact same way for basically every question. For example, they asked each of them who the father of their children was, and every single one of them answered, "I don't know." So the church wives weren't really giving them much information, but once detectives tracked down some of the former members, they heard the exact same horror stories that Carol had reported. The beatings, the sexual abuse of the women and some of the children, the spitting in the face, controlling every aspect of their lives. And at that point, police knew that they had enough to bring charges against not just Fred, but also his brother Judson. Now, I could not find any stories about Judson in my research, so I don't know exactly what his role was in the cult, but I do know that he must have been a pretty horrible person because he, along with Fred, were both facing some very serious charges. Fred was charged with assault, sexual exploitation, assault causing bodily harm, uttering death threats, and assault with a weapon. And Judson was charged with assault, assault with a weapon, and uttering death threats. But when Fred and Judson realized that everything was starting to crumble, they decided to go on the run. Judson was found on April 4th, 2014, and Fred was found 10 days later after an officer noticed a license plate with a number associated with the King family parked in a hotel parking lot in the city of Hamilton. Officers discovered that the room reservation was under the name of Linda King, which is Fred King's legal wife. Police started surveilling the hotel, and they watched Fred King walk out of the hotel room and into a van with his wife, and they arrested him on the spot. And I wish that I could tell you that Fred's sentence was satisfying, but sadly, that is not the case. Fred ended up taking a plea deal. He agreed to plead guilty if the sexual offenses were removed from the list of charges. And in the end, Fred King was only sentenced to 18 months in prison, and he only actually served 12 months of that sentence. Not nearly enough time. It's honestly tragic. There have been claims that the cult has disbanded, but that's not widely believed by former members.
It was here in this courthouse in Owen Sound where the man known as the Prophet was sentenced today in a long-standing case. Frederick Madison King was the leader of the Church of the Jesus Christ Restored in Chatsworth. Originally, he faced more than 24 charges after he was exposed in a CTV W5 documentary. Eventually, he was convicted of 9 counts of assault on 5 victims, 3 of them under 18 years old. Today, he was sentenced to 18 months in jail, followed by 2 years of parole. He's also been ordered to undergo counseling, provide a DNA sample, and he's been banned from owning a gun. Relatives of some church members were on hand for the verdict.
I'm actually really happy that what was asked for, he got, but I wish it was so much more.
There were harsh words inside the court today as well. The Crown said King abused his position of power and sadistically assaulted, humiliated, spat on, and verbally abused his victims. The judge took into account the fact that King had no criminal past and that he pleaded guilty, saving victims from an emotional trial. But he also had stern words for King, saying few things are more revolting than being violent and denigrating with women and children. King's church is supposedly disbanded, but families who came to court today say the organization they called the cult still has a grip on their loved ones.
But I'm hoping that the people that are left in the cult, and I understand from talking to people that they're not happy with the way things have been, and hopefully they'll have enough courage to change it and get on with life.
And I tried to find an update on Carol's youngest son, Marcus, just to see if he had finally left the cult, but unfortunately I could not find any information about that. I also could not find any information on Judson's sentence. I would imagine that if Fred only got 18 months, that Judson probably got much less than that. Several of the former members have had a pretty hard time adjusting to life outside of the cult. There's been at least one former member that has died by suicide, and several more have struggled with substance abuse. My hope is that the remaining members soon find their way out and the former members have found their peace. And that is all I have on this case. Let me know what you guys think about this one down in the comments. Don't forget to click the link in the description box if you want to give Wild Grain a try. You can use my code SUMMER to get $30 off your order and free croissants for life. If you found this video interesting, please consider subscribing, liking this video, and leaving me a comment. That is the easiest way for you to support me and my channel. And as always, I appreciate each and every one of you for watching, and I will see you next time.